Hello everybody and welcome to the show. I'm back again with Tim Wyatt and today we're going to talk about death. And before Tim speaks, I'm going to give a little quote from Socrates. So this is from Socrates. To fear death is nothing other than to think oneself wise when one is not. For it is to think one knows what one does not know. No man knows whether death may not even turn out to be the greatest blessing for a human being. And yet people fear it as if they knew for certain that it is the greatest of evil. So, Tim, thank you for coming to the show and talking today with me about what many people would think a bit of a morbid subject, but I don't think it's morbid. It's something that happens to us all, and there's many ways of looking at death. What would you have to say to that?
Well, if we fear death, then it means essentially that we fear life as well. And so many people go through life being terrified of what's going to happen at the end. And so in the West, largely, it's something which we tend to ignore and avoid as much as possible. And it doesn't really make a very comfortable topic for the dinner table conversation either for many people. And so I think at the time we're living through at the moment, when death is all around us, in everybody's face, in everybody's lives, affecting virtually every part of the world, it's something which is unavoidable. And so it might, in a strange way, afford an opportunity to explore this particular subject. Now, I've always had an interest in it since I was a very young child. And over the past 3 years, I've been doing a lot of really in-depth research into death and karma and the law of cause and effect, and also reincarnation as well. And this is a major work that I'm trying to finish at the moment during all this lockdown. But many years ago, when the Theosophical Society was first formed in 1875 and Madame Blavatsky was at her height doing all her writings, she said on more than one occasion that the most important lesson that humanity had to learn were the laws, these twin interlocking laws of reincarnation and karma. And she said effectively that if people had a different understanding of this and understood and appreciated that life continues out of the physical body, and that the lives we lead are sequential and we come back again and again and again in physical bodies to this place of learning, Earth School, as I prefer to call it, then that will have a transformative effect on humanity's consciousness. And it will. It definitely will. And I think we're at a time now where there has become vast interest in these ideas. If you'd ask people about reincarnation, say, 50, 60, 70 years ago, in the middle part of the 20th century, it wasn't a widely known concept outside a few esoteric circles. It certainly wasn't embedded in mainstream consciousness. But today, when they do surveys into this sort of thing about people's beliefs and attitudes, they found that between a quarter and a third of people believe in rebirth in some form. In fact, in some American surveys, you find more people believe in rebirth than actually believe in God.
Which is quite strange, isn't it? Because you think to have rebirth or reincarnation, there's got to be a cause. And maybe that cause would come back to a divinity or a divine being of some kind.
Well, I think it's because people's notions of God have been so badly skewed by the mainstream religions that people have deserted this idea now. And although they believe perhaps that they have a soul which somehow survives death, certainly the mainstream religions have a very fuzzy idea of what this is all about. And the idea that we just get warehoused in some place until a day of judgment and all this kind of stuff. Although that is a vague description and a vaguely accurate description of what might happen, it only describes one little part of it. And I think the important thing here, Debbie, is for people to understand that there is a continuum to life and death. It's all part of these cycles that we go through. Everything goes through a similar cycle, whether it's very short or very long, in which we're born, we develop, we grow, we reach a point of maturity, we begin to decline, and then we forsake our physical body in order to live in the invisible realms, if we might call it that. And all the evidence points to the fact that we spend far more time out of bodies than we do in them. And one of the interesting bits of research that I've been doing is into things like near-death experiences. These are where people, often on the operating table in hospitals, or people who've survived car crashes or had other traumatic things happen to them. They can be triggered by a number of sources. They all describe a very similar pattern of events that happen. And they go down a tube and they're met by other beings, families, friends, wise people, Buddha, Jesus, whoever. They're led through beautiful landscapes, and then they reach a point where they're told they can't go any further and you have to go back. And many people are deeply reluctant to go back. They don't want to do this. And similarly, we're told when people are regressed into past lives, and there's been a lot of work done in this particular field, when people are preparing to come back into incarnation, they're often very, very deeply reluctant to do so. In fact, the majority of people would prefer to stay where they are in the heaven world, in the mental world, Devachan, rather than coming back to go through all the rigors and hardships and traumas that we have to face on Earth. And sometimes, the way I understand it, they have to be severely prodded in order to, find a body to be born in again. Otherwise, they just kind of languish around in this wonderful paradise, sipping metaphysical celestial beaches or whatever they do.
Maybe that's why babies come out screaming when they are born.
Well, that could be the reason. That could be the reason. But there certainly does appear to be a reluctance on the part of people to, particularly when they become more advanced beings and when they've had more incarnations and they have a deeper understanding of what it's all about. Because the way I understand it is that as we develop, we require less help on the inner planes to decide who we are in the next life, where we reincarnate, who our parents are, what our circumstances are, what our environment happens to be. In the early stages, there are those who advise on these sorts of things, and they go by various names. In Theosophy, they're referred to by many names, but the Lords of Karma are one of the titles that they have. But as we progress and can make decisions for ourselves and develop perhaps a greater degree of responsibility, we tend to have more free will and tend to know who our parents will be. I mean, when you talk to people about this idea, people who are non-spiritual peoples, and say to them, we choose our parents, they're absolutely horrified by this idea. Because one of the phrases that's so deeply embedded in the English language is, oh, you can't choose your parents. And yes, that's exactly what we do.
And from choosing our parents, some people say it's because we come back with the same kind of family. Not necessarily they're our parents this time, maybe in the next life they're our children. So it's like a soul group coming back and forth over and over again, or a mixture. In the next life you might be with a different soul group, but a soul group you'd been with 3 lifetimes ago or something like that. So it's all like you were saying, cycles. It's still cycles going round.
Yes, and it may be because there are these soul groups that may dictate how and when we come into incarnation, because clearly we have karmic bonds with these people, good and bad, and we all play different roles with each other in these different lives. So even our enemies and the people we don't like and who don't like us, we are karmically entangled with those people, and we will have to encounter them again. But these soul groups are very, very interesting, and they might be families. We might come back as someone else's sister or uncle or brother or close friend or whatever it happens to be. But it does seem clear, and the evidence is quite strong for this, that these soul groups do exist. But they might also exist in other ways, for example, through communities of interest. It may be that a number of writers or musicians or scientists or lawmakers or any particular profession also decide to reincarnate in the same place at the same time, or have contact with each other in this increasingly interconnected world. because they have some particular task to achieve or some job to do. And so this is very persuasive, and the evidence from the people who do a lot of hypnotic regression into past lives show that there are these bonds appearing again and again and again through numerous case histories. Of course, it's quite difficult for us to disentangle these things. And we clearly don't know all the relationships that we have because we're largely unaware of past lives. But nevertheless, to accept the existence of these soul groupings and the fact that they have a dynamic on us as people, and they have a dynamic effect on where and when we might be born, is something that's very interesting to consider. And this is where things become also very interesting, because we're not just talking then about our own individual karma, we're talking about collective karma. And if individual karma is hard enough to disentangle, imagine what collective karma is like to disentangle. You know, how many billions of people have lived on Earth? Because that is the human karma. Think of all the things that people have done and said and thought about each other. And it produces a situation which even the supercomputers probably couldn't unravel. So understanding that we have, you know, we're subject to individual cause and effect in our lives, but it goes much deeper than that. There's also the karma of the organizations that we belong to, the country that we live in, the town that we live in has its own karma. Everything in its own way has karmic resonances. And clearly we're born into particular places because of reasons that we often don't understand, but it's vital that we're in these particular places for some reason or another. And to be aware of that, I think, is good, because it gives you a sense of power, that you weren't just accidentally, randomly, purposelessly born into one place. There was a reason for it. And this is why the laws of karma and reincarnation are so important, because they take all the accidental, random nature that most people assume is the case out of it, and they put you in the driving seat to some extent.
So that comes down to the idea that things are not accidental, and sometimes people find that difficult to understand, that everything, not necessarily, is it fated? Is it like the right word to use?
Well, if you speak strictly about this, there really isn't any such thing as an accident. There isn't really such a thing as a random event or a synchronicity or anything of those things. There's no such thing as chance or luck, because if we use words like this, we're assuming that we live in a world without causes, and everything has a cause. Accidents, which appear to be accidents, can be due to all sorts of reasons. If it's a car crash, it might be the road is wet, somebody might have left a fridge in the middle of a motorway, we might be drunk, the tires might be bald on the car, someone else might be drunk and be driving a car with bald tires. Who knows? But there are particular causes for this. And so it's not just some random event which happens. It does have a deeper purpose to it, even if we don't know what that purpose is.
And it's all so complex, which is why there's these lords of karma helping run it all, or to make sure it's all running smoothly, for a better word, but it's not smoothly because it's quite chaotic for the rest of us. But coming round for all this, then in some ways we don't have, we think we've got free will, but maybe we haven't.
Well, I think about this a lot, Debbie, and we do have a degree of free will, although we come into life with karma, and then there are other Eastern words, dharma, which is usually described as duty, and which you could regard as proper conduct, or even maybe stretch it to include something like soul purpose. We have astrological influences, which will no doubt be influenced by karma as well. And then we come into life with things that in Sanskrit are called skandhas, which tend to be, you know, various different types of attributes. And so it's important to remember that although we have free will to a degree, and the more advanced we become, the more free will we develop, because with free will comes great responsibility, because we realize as we go on, we cannot just do as we wish. We have to take into account the karmic consequences of everything that we do or say or think or feel. It's not just actions. It also operates on the level of emotions, on the astral level, and on the mental level as well. So our thoughts also have karmic consequences. And then to make it even more complicated, there are basically three different types of karma. There's the karma we've built up in previous lives, which we're discharging now in some way or dealing with. There's the karma from previous lives that we haven't yet dealt with. And it's often said under the laws of karma that we're never faced with anything that we ultimately can't take. Although it's there to test us, it's not there to crush or annihilate us. And then the third type of karma is the karma that we're building up right now, which we will have to deal with in future lives. And of course, these things are not always completely distinct strands, and they may blend into each other as well to provide an even more complicated picture.
We were saying earlier about Madame Blavatsky and bringing her into it. And it's something that she was trying to tell people about, that, you know, everybody seems to think they want to live forever, or they're going to live forever, and don't contemplate death at all, which is what we were saying at the beginning. So I think she was trying to prepare people for their deaths. And then in that way, you kind of lead a better life, because you know you're going to at some point die. So you try to make use of every moment of your life.
Yes, and also, if you appreciate the fact that what you do has consequences, whatever you do has consequences of some kind or another down the line, it doesn't take long for you to realize that you have to modify your behavior, and that you can't behave irresponsibly and you can't behave selfishly, because by God, you will pay for it. So an understanding of these laws, by definition, is going to make people less selfish, less self-centered, be more aware of their actions, and perhaps behave in a more altruistic way towards other people. One of the interesting things I was researching the other day was about the American psychic called Edgar Cayce. He's often known as the sleeping prophet. And he did loads and loads and loads of readings of people, mainly for health reasons. And often these were just letters that he received, and he would lie down on the couch and then come up with all sorts of grandiose diagnoses. Now, the interesting thing about Casey was that he was a Presbyterian. He didn't believe in reincarnation. He wasn't a trained doctor. He had no expert knowledge on these things, and yet his diagnoses were absolutely spot on. But more interesting is that when he was dealing with people with disabilities, he would often identify karmic causes, many of them going back to Atlantean times. For example, he was communicating with one person who was deaf, and he simply said to this other person in his message, it was quite blunt. He said, now you'll know that you have to listen to people in this life. So clearly the implication was this person had ignored something or ignored people regularly, and in this life had to pay for it through this disability. And I've also been doing quite a lot of research into how karma affects us in this life in terms of illness and disease and phobia. Because many phobias, it's thought, also have their roots in past lives. You know, fear of snakes, fear of heights, fear of yellow curtains, whatever it happens to be. And people's illnesses, it's often said, may be the result of things that they've done in past lives, or may be something more collective, and may also be the residue of things that happened in Atlantis when there were very many malpractices going on. In fact, the more I think about it, the more Atlantean civilization seems to mirror, from what we know of it, seems to mirror the world that we live in now, because we're also manipulating dark forces and trying to manipulate matter and doing essentially black magic, because science, despite all the things it's apparently brought us, is very amoral at best and very immoral at the worst. It's not always something that you can describe as moral. And when we have a new discovery, our initial tendency is either to commercialize it or to weaponize it in some way. You know, we fight with it, and then we make some money out of it afterwards. And of course, these things will have karmic consequences down the line. People who carry out vivisection on animals, people who build nuclear devices, people who concoct viruses in laboratories wherever or whatever they do. These things will all reverberate at some future point in that person's future life. And so if we accept that there is such a continuum and such a dynamic and such a cosmic law in operation, you know, it's a wake-up call to us, and it's a real opportunity for us to evolve as people. I think it offers the best opportunity of any of the teachings. And if more people accepted this, it would be a much, much more benign and better world, I think.
I have to say, I've just finished reading a book all about Edgar Cayce and his time in Atlantis. And you're completely right. He didn't believe in reincarnation. It was through these channelings that he was getting that he and his family suddenly realized that they do live over and over again. You keep coming back. And his life in Atlantis, he was a character called Ra-Ta, and he was here to give them esoteric teachings. But and that was when it was Atlantis doing good things, rather before it started having the wrong people manipulating. And as you say, they were using strange science that wasn't for the better good of the world or the people. It was very about them and themselves, and in a kind of materialistic way that ended up having the whole land sink beneath the waves and the people having to spread out. So thanks for bringing Edgar Cayce up, but he's another great one if you wanted to learn about reincarnation and hadn't really thought about it before. Reading about him, he explains it very well. And of course,
Yes.
I don't think he ever knew Blavatsky, but he met quite a few theosophists during his time.
Yes, and because his books were so popular and still are to some extent, I think this is a way of kind of getting these ideas into the mainstream. And it's certainly an idea which has become more and more deeply embedded in Western thought, probably starting around about the 1960s, when there was all that interest in Eastern mysticism of different kinds, and people started exploring other spiritual options outside mainstream Christianity, which was obviously the predominant thing in Europe and in America. And so it offered a very rich new seam that people could tap into and explore. Of course, when you talk to many people, many intelligent people, they just are absolutely dismissive of this. And they describe it either as primitive superstition or wishful thinking or something that you can't prove. And they have a point insofar as you can't prove it. Part of the book that I'm writing is called Evidence for Reincarnation, but none of it provides absolute proof. And you can never do this, because what the materialistic people are asking you to do is to find physical proof for something that is essentially non-physical, because we're only in bodies, as I said earlier on, for a certain proportion, a small proportion of our existence. And therefore, all the other stuff takes place on different levels, on the astral level, on the mental level. This is where we are for most of the time, without bodies. And then when you say to the materialistic people, oh, well, you don't need a brain in order to be able to think, they assume that consciousness emerges from the brain, and the brain is not a receiver of consciousness. And I think the best way of looking at it is to regard the brain as a television receiver rather than a TV recorder. And it's just something we use on the physical level. And to understand that we can have consciousness outside physical bodies and after death is a very important thing. But the materialists have a great problem with all this.
It's because they can't, I think it's because they can't find somewhere to put it. They want consciousness put in a little box, and it's either in your head, or I think the ancient Egyptians said it was in your heart. And because they can't find it, because it is a strange thing, isn't it? Why are we conscious? Why are we like we are? It's very peculiar. So there must be something special about us. And I was going to say to you, do you think it's the consciousness that keeps reincarnating? Because it's not your physical body, is it? Your physical body dies, but your consciousness comes back, but doesn't seem to remember the past lives.
Well, there are reasons why we don't remember past lives. And if you imagine that if we were burdened with our brutish behavior in the past and all the horrible things that we've done, we'd be so consumed with guilt that we wouldn't be able to get on with our present life. And also, can you remember what you were doing 2 years last Tuesday, or even 3 weeks ago? And so these things become a burden and they act as a screen. It is said that once we get to a certain degree of development, we do see our past lives and see all the karmic consequences. And it's sometimes said that we can see this in the inner worlds after we die, in that time between lives. And we stop looking on each life as an individual thing and just look on it as one life in and out of bodies. You mentioned also about consciousness, and well, the universe is consciousness, and everything around us in the material world is simply consciousness in its crudest, most physical and material form. So there is nothing else but consciousness. Blavatsky was one of the first people, not the only one, but certainly one of the first people in the modern age to say that everything has consciousness, even parts of the mineral kingdom, even rocks have consciousness, not like human consciousness, but consciousness on their own level. And rocks are evolving, as are all the other kingdoms of nature, the vegetable and plant kingdom, and also the animal kingdom as well. They all have consciousness of one sort or another. It's quite clear that the earth is a living being which has its own consciousness. That consciousness is not independent of us, because that consciousness is largely made up of our consciousness and all the consciousness from the other kingdoms of nature. So that is a collective consciousness. But to describe the earth as a dead rock and all the other celestial bodies as that is ludicrous, because also we know in the theosophical tradition that these globes or planets exist in other forms besides the physical. They exist in astral form, in mental form, and in the higher spiritual forms as well. Just because we can't see them, we shouldn't be arrogant to believe that they don't exist, because we know that these other levels exist, the astral, the mental, and the others. And therefore, if there are worlds there, then it means there are planets there as well.
Well, going back to consciousness, I feel that everybody wants to live forever, and that the scientists are trying to find a way to make us live forever, and we've got the kind of concern hanging over our heads of transhumanism, and that in 100 years' time they will somehow be able to put us into robots. I don't quite get how they're going to do it, because I think consciousness is a separate thing, and I do write about that in my book, Monkey Mind, Robot Body. But what do you think about the future of mankind? Because if we do get our consciousness taken out and put into a robot, that means we never die, and surely that would be not ending a cycle, we're continuing something forever.
Well, I'm not sure that that's possible. Just as I'm not sure it's possible or wise for people to have themselves cryogenically frozen and stored in a laboratory until they can be revived. Because what are you going to revive? Just a physical body, that's it. And this transhumanism stuff really is ludicrous, because we live forever anyway, just we don't live in the same body, just as most of us don't live in the same house all our lives. Some of us move around quite a lot into different places. And if we imagine that living in the same body has some sort of advantage, then that's also absurd, because one of the purposes of reincarnation is to play as many different roles, experience as many different things, to resolve your karma in whatever way you can. But it's all about learning and growing and evolving and becoming something else. And if we adhere to this notion that we can prolong one physical life with all sorts of bits stuck inside us, then it becomes ludicrous. And it's also counter to the economy of the universe, because the economy of the universe stipulates that nothing stays the same for the tiniest fraction of a second. Everything must move on. And this is why, you know, we start as babies and end up as, hopefully, as wizened old people, with all sorts of things wrong with us, because that is the continuum. And to try and artificially change that in some way, I think is a very, very dangerous step. And it might be that this is humanity's new Atlantean behavior.
Yes, I kind of wonder that myself. I did want to say, in some ways, what Blavatsky is trying to help us with is to have, or through the ageless wisdom, to tell us that death is an illusion. You know, she's trying to explain to us that it's not the end of everything, which is like what we were saying earlier. The people that aren't into this kind of thing think that's it, it's over, you're gone, there's no more of you. But we're trying to teach through the ageless wisdom that we do exist, we will continue.
Well, it's only because people are ignorant of the fact that we do come in and out of incarnation that they have this fear of death. And this fear of death, as we said at the start of this conversation, is one of the things that blights people's lives. And it also distorts their view of reality as well. Because it must be, if you do think that physical death is annihilation and total obliteration of consciousness and oblivion, then you're going to be frightened. Although why would you be? Because if you have no consciousness, there's nothing to be frightened about anyway. So either way you look at it, death is a good outcome. It's a logical outcome. And we need to start accepting it in a different way. During my researches, I found that most of the societies, in most cultures, in most geographical parts of the world, have had some notion about an afterlife. They don't all believe in reincarnation, but they all believe in the survival of the soul or the spirit or some inner essence of us. And if so many people have believed this over so many millennia, it's very arrogant of us now to say, oh, they were wrong. They were just primitive savages living in caves who didn't understand the workings of the universe. They weren't scientists. They didn't have all this wonderful technology, but they did have an inner wisdom, and they had a purer form of wisdom than exists in most parts of the world today. So were they all wrong? And we in the modern age have got it absolutely right? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so, because I think people think that we're progressing, when I think, in fact, we've lost that kind of thought, haven't we? We've forgotten how to think and live that kind of way. I'm not quite sure how it happened. Maybe it was because of the sinking of Atlantis, or maybe it was something else, but we definitely were more in touch with our ancestors. And as ancestors, our ancestors were more in touch with how life works. They seemed to understand that they were going to die, and have a better understanding of what death is, where now does seem to be a fearful thing.
Well, we also have to remember that the modern world probably started, when did it start? What should we say, from the point of view of the Industrial Revolution, which started in England in the 1770s? We can take it from that time, although before that were the ages of enlightenment, the ages of reason, the Renaissance. So there'd been a slow build-up towards this. But since the Industrial Revolution, and we've drastically reshaped all the countries that we live in, and we've gone from being a rural agrarian society where 90% of people lived in the country and 10% of people lived in towns and cities, to a reversal of that, where most people live in urban conurbations now. And because of that, and because of all the mechanization, mass production, and all the other things, we've lost touch with nature. We've lost touch with the rhythms of life. And we've also lost, to some degree, touch with ourselves, with that inner voice, which people don't listen to now because it interferes with watching Coronation Street or going to watch a Justin Bieber concert or something. And so we need to restore that direct connection. And a number of people over the last few weeks of lockdown have been commenting on this, saying that they can hear birds in their garden again for the first time, and that they can actually hear the sounds of nature because there's hardly any traffic noise and there are a few planes flying in the sky. And so this might be having a beneficial effect as far as that goes. But I don't think many people are prepared to listen to those little voices inside them. They don't trust them and they don't believe them largely. And this is a mistake, because I think we all have a deep innate knowledge that we've been here before and we come here again. I remember when I was about 8 years old, standing in the school playground and realizing this. And it just dawned on me that I'd been here, not in that playground, but I'd been on this planet before and I'd done things before. And I was only vaguely aware of what that could possibly mean at that age. But it's a belief that I retained throughout my childhood, even though I was brought up in a kind of a conventionally Christian, but not very devout family, thankfully. And it's an idea which has just developed in me throughout my life. And my conviction about it is stronger each day. And the more I look into it and the more I look at the evidence for this, I can't see any other logical way that the universe could operate.
I think a lot of people, when you was talking about the inner voice, they don't want to listen to that inner voice, do they? They like to be told what to believe. And obviously at the moment, scientists are the ones we should be listening to and have been for about the last 100 years. So they're listening to all these scientists that only come from an intellectual way of thinking of, well, this is it, this is the one life. There's nothing afterwards.
Yeah, and also scientists tend to operate not from the higher mind of philosophical principles and appreciations of truth and beauty. They're using the concrete mind. Much science today is just about crunching data. It's making observations of the universe or particles in the Large Hadron Collider, or getting information from satellites and space stations and so on, and then just crunching all that and just analyzing it using algorithms. So it's become a very mathematically based thing. And although there are intuitive scientists and always have been, and some of the finest discoveries of science have come through intuition. Einstein worked that way, and many others have spoken about similar processes going on. But science has clearly become, science and its twin, technology, have become the new religion. And it's what people tend to believe. And scientists talk in a way that they cannot be disbelieved in any way. Even though the science of 2020 is completely different from the science that I learned back in the 1960s when I was at school, just as that science was very different from the science that had been taught in the 1890s before people like Einstein came on the scene and before they discovered quantum physics. So science is evolving. And for it to say that it has all the answers and has got everything proved is absolutely ridiculous, because it hasn't. And as long as science refuses to understand that there are other levels of reality beyond the physical, then we're not going to get anywhere with them. And they are just simply going to go down one blind alley after another. As and when they do start to believe that there are, for example, other states of physical matter, the etheric levels, then that will be a game changer in itself. And when they actually discover and admit that there is an astral world, which is the template for the physical world, a lot of the questions that they now ask will become much more easy to answer at that point.
In ancient times, because I've noticed Tutankhamun's sarcophagus behind you, the science, well, it wasn't really, didn't have a name in ancient Egypt as science, but when they were looking at things in a scientific way, their scientific way, it would have been from a religious point of view, which is why they treated death quite differently to the way we did.
Yes, this is another problem, of course, with reincarnation, because all matters spiritual have been hijacked by the religions, and therefore reincarnation is seen solely as a religious thing, but it's not. It's something that's to do with science, and it's something that's to do with philosophy. And so it can't just be regarded as a religious thing. It's a process of nature. And therefore, it should come under the realm of science and philosophy rather than religion, in my opinion. But to prize it out of the hands of religion, who've jealously held on to it for so long, is a very, very difficult matter. And as you said earlier on, Debbie, yes, people like to be told what to think and what to believe. They don't really want to have to think for themselves a lot of the time. They want other diversions like television and rugby league and, you know, all the other things that we do, music concerts, which we all enjoy in our own way. But they should never become something which stops us from devoting that time to ourselves, you know, listening to that inner voice. Of course, some people do find this very, very difficult, to not be in contact with other people, to not have constant external stimulation coming in. But more and more people, probably during all this, have had a bit more time to reflect on things, because you can't spend all day, you know, watching old episodes of soap operas or films on the television. You know, you have to do something else at some point, don't you?
I think with people in the past as well, when they knew they were going to die, they knew they were going to join their gods. Like, for example, with the northern traditions, they thought they were going to, you know, Valhalla or whatever, to be with Odin and Thor, and with the ancient Egyptian ones, they'd be off to the Duat to join their gods to live out there. But that kind of thing isn't really acceptable in today's world.
Well, no, it's just looked on as fairies at the bottom of the garden and that sort of thing, isn't it? And yet, we're told that when we do die and we do move initially into the astral realm, because this is not a place as such, it's a state of consciousness more than a place, and it's a subjective realm. So if we go there with a Christian perspective, and we imagine pearly gates and thrones and roads made of gold, or we imagine devils with pitchforks shoving us into the flames, then that's probably what we will get, because we have coloured our expectations, which have been modified through our religious or non-religious beliefs. So to some extent, this is a world that we create. And particularly the next port of call on our after-death journey, the mental world, the heaven of the Christians, if you like, is a place which is even more moulded by our own consciousness. And it's not externally created by anyone. It's simply a product of our own consciousness. And here we can go and have all sorts of different opportunities. But if we were a Viking, yeah, we would expect to meet Thor and Odin. If we'd been born in the Hindu tradition, we would have expected to meet Shiva and Brahma and all the other members of the Hindu pantheon as well. So it's just a question of how it's coloured. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is quite interesting, because that is quite a colourful book, and it, you know, it talks about things like the luminosity and the different bardo states where there are horrifying monsters and this, that, and the other. And of course, in Christianity, we have this idea of a purgatory where souls are somehow purified or cleansed or refined in some way before moving on. And actually, that is not necessarily so far from the truth, because the astral plane is the place where we do that. It is effectively a factory for refining out the coarser aspects of ourselves and then distilling the best bits into something which can be stored up and used in future lives. These are referred to by various names like permanent atoms or seed atoms or life atoms. But the idea is that we get rid of all the dross. So it's like a kind of purification process that we go through. And this could be where the very distorted Christian picture of purgatory comes from. Because the lower levels of the astral plane, it's divided, it is said, into 7 subplanes, each of which attracts a certain type of person. So the lower levels are really horrible for the world's worst people. I mean, we're talking, you know, murderers and killers and people who committed genocide and all sorts of other people. And then there are planes where the religiously devout gather together. There are places where the more intellectual people gather together. And this operates just as it does on the physical plane through that other law, the law of attraction. People are like-minded people are attracted to other people. Musicians like being with other musicians. Sports people like being with other sports people. People who are into molecular biology like to spend time with other molecular biologists. You know, it's quite an obvious thing. And the astral plane seems to operate to some degree on that principle as well.
So it's not necessarily oh, you've had a really bad life, so we're going to give you a nice new heaven to live in. It's what you're creating, isn't it? Which is something I think a lot of people don't understand. They think instead, let's say, for example, you know, a woman's feeling bad about herself and constantly attracts men that beat her up or whatever. If she's going to think that she's thinking that kind of way, and that might be the kind of world she ends up in when she's passed on, rather than trying to create a nice heaven for herself. A very
Well,
simple way of putting
absolutely.
it.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be, you know, if you go into death with many unresolved things and you're putting out all sorts of vibrations, that the vibrations we put out in life and in every other state is what we get back. You know, if we put out hostile, negative vibrations to other people, that's what we get. If we put out more friendly and loving vibrations to people, then we're more likely to attract those. And we're more likely to attract opportunities to ourselves if we remain relatively optimistic and upbeat people. Good things don't happen to pessimists very often because they don't expect them to happen. And therefore they kind of exclude the possibility of anything good happening. Oh, this always happens to me. And it becomes a self-reinforcing loop that they get into, and they play it over and over and over again to themselves. And each time they do that, they make themselves a little bit more negative and a little bit more pessimistic. And so to understand that we are in control, that there might be higher entities, and there are higher entities, but to regard God as someone like a high court judge just dispensing justice and being sadistic towards us for no reason is not the way to think about it. And it's not good to think that it's always external things which affect us. We affect ourselves. We are the creators. We are the co-creators of the universe. And this is what we should imagine. We're not victims. We're not flotsam and jetsam on the ocean. We are conscious, evolving individual beings who are linked to other beings. And this is how we manage to move forward. And the more we move forward, the more control that we have, and the more ability we have to shape ourselves and to shape the environment that we're in a better way, I think.
So it's taking responsibility of our actions and our emotions and our thought forms. Taking responsibility of everything that we do.
Well, yes, indeed, indeed, because the thought forms that we create around ourselves, you know, we think these are private thoughts, but along with our emotions, which operate on the astral level, these form our aura. And whether people can see auras or not, they can certainly detect them. Because you can, if you're walking down the street, you can tell if someone's absolutely angry and seething inside, even if they don't have an expression on their face. There is something that surrounds them. And these are the thought forms, which many of the esoteric writers have spoken about. In fact, Annie Besant, the second president of the Theosophical Society, she wrote a wonderful book about this, about 120 years, did some illustrations of various thought forms. And these actually show that if you feel anger, it's like red, jagged forks of lightning going out of the side of your head. Whereas if you think wonderful things, it tends to be in mauve, pastel, violet colors, which are gentle shaped and everything. Whereas the angry emotions are jagged and so on. And I think a good illustration of how consciousness does affect the world was carried out by a very interesting Japanese professor called Professor Emoto. And he did some really interesting work where he took samples of water from all sorts of different places, from municipal water supplies, Buddhist temples, from mountain streams, and he froze them. And he found that the ones from the pure environments had beautiful symmetrical structures to them, whereas the ones from the municipal water supply, which had fluoride and all sorts of other things in them, were horrible and jagged and malformed things. And then he also did other experiments whereby he got Buddhist monks to chant over some water, and that produced wonderful effects. And then he started playing music to the water, Beethoven, Chopin, some of the classical stuff. produced really beautiful forms. But when he started playing heavy metal and punk to it, again, the crystals became all jagged and malformed. But he even went further than that. He put water in a jar with a label on it which said love, and another one which said hate. The water from the one containing the word love produced beautiful crystals. The one with hate produced jagged crystals. Can water read? How does that work? But clearly there is something operating here, and it shows how consciousness affects physical matter.
Yes, I love it. And because of his work, I started on my water bottles for work. I used to put the sign, and on my lunch box I'd have love written across, because those kind of things are important. If it's going to put good vibrations and make sure my food or my water's all beautifully made out, rather than all, like you say, the ones with the bad music were all going and horrible. If they had war written on them, they all crunched up and went all dark and looked all unhappy. So we want things to be good. So it is what our intention is, and what them words are like spells, aren't they? The word is the way. Word is what created everything.
Well, yeah, and we often say in the esoteric world that energy follows thought, and that's absolutely true. Because I think, as I said to you the other day in another interview we did, that everything begins on the mental level. There aren't any exceptions to this, really. And then it gets eventually percolated down onto the physical level. So once we have an intention to do something, this is important. It's also, I've also been studying for this book about suicide, which we always say is something that's the worst thing that you can do. But, we have to be a bit careful about this. If someone kills themselves to avoid responsibilities in some way, or through acts of cowardice or selfishness, that's one thing. But if you sacrifice yourself in order to protect 10 other people, if somebody threw a hand grenade into a room and you fall on the hand grenade to mask the force of it and protect the other people, that's a form of suicide. But it's the intention which is important. You've done it through an altruistic intention, not through any sense of selfishness as well. So with everything in life, it's about the intention that you do it. Two people can do the same act, but one does it with a feeling of love and an altruism about them. The other person does it grudgingly, and the two things are not the same, because it's the intention of the doer that is absolutely paramount about all this stuff.
And I suppose another thing about the work of, say, Blavatsky and such like, I was saying to us earlier, it's about preparing us for our deaths, but we're intending to try and have a good death. I know sometimes some people get hit by a bus and get killed that way, so haven't got time to prepare themselves. But if we can have a good death, then hopefully that will take us on to our next world, and then on to our next life, with better circumstances.
Well, it's said that it is crucial how we die, and the thoughts we have at death are very important for the afterlife, but also can have an impact on our future incarnations as well. And the last thing you want at death is a lot of strong emotion. You don't want relatives wailing and screeching around the bed, because although that person appears to be unconscious in the bed, they're not. They're quite aware of a lot of the things that are going on. And also, if there is that kind of strong emotion, this can have the effect of attaching people to the earth sphere and being unable to move on, and desperately wanting to cling on to life. And this probably is one of the explanations for ghosts and hauntings, people who cannot move from a particular location because of some attachment to it. Some people feel attached because they've got responsibilities that they haven't discharged, or they may be worried about how their families will survive now that they can no longer earn any money. There can be all sorts of different reasons for it. But certainly how we lead this life is very important. And in the West, the vast majority of people die in hospital now with some sort of medical intervention, often with tubes and all that sort of stuff sticking out of them. And this is clearly not the best way to go. I know that in hospices and hospitals, they develop very, very good ways now of helping people to move on, far better than they were in the past. And the hospice movement, I think, is fantastic. It was really the work largely, although they've been around for a long time. There's a woman called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who did a lot of work because she felt that dying people were just almost neglected, and they were just, you know, left there to their own devices. And she identified a number of different stages in the death process where people initially, when they're told they're going to die, are completely shocked, then they go into denial, then they go into depression, then they go into bargaining with God. Oh, please, God, let me live because I want to do this. And finally, they reach this point of acceptance. And so these 4 or 5 distinct stages of dying have now become almost like a benchmark, a kind of a manual for how people are dealt with. Of course, not everybody feels exactly the same thing, but because people who do understand the notion of reincarnation will not go into all this plea bargaining with God, and they won't necessarily be depressed. They might not be terribly happy that they're going to leave the earth at this time, but they know that they will be round again at some point after this 1,000-year holiday in the afterlife, or however long it is. And that's another interesting thing, but how long we spend in between lives, but this seems to vary from a very short time to thousands of years, and so it's something that you cannot particularly resolve. And it's also probably dictated by ourselves, our own stage of development, and the cyclic necessity of the time, because if we do, as we were saying earlier on, reincarnate with other people, we all may have to do it together at some point to achieve something or other, whether we like it or not.
Well, this has been a fascinating talk, Tim. I'm going to bring it to an end, and hopefully people will watch this and perhaps rethink about how their death's going to be, or death, you know, everybody dies. Maybe that will even make you look at people differently if they take that into consideration, that at some point everybody's going to die. So that person you're talking to is not going to be around forever, and neither are you or me or anybody. So thank you very much, Tim. Do you know when your book's out?
It should be out sometime in the autumn. I'm just finally finishing it at the moment, so I'm hoping to publish it sometime in September or October, maybe.
Okay, then well, good luck with that, and we shall make sure that's promoted. Thanks again, Tim. It's been wonderful chatting to you as always.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Good to talk to you as well.